And so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jason
All
and get
right.
off video.
Thank you for getting us started, Alex. And thank all of you guys for submitting your questions. I did the best I could to kind of summarize them, and we'll address the highest rated ones. And this is a really interesting topic. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I actually started my career in tech at Forrester Research, conducting primary research. Every other month, I had to interview 50 end users of technology to understand their challenges, their perceptions. So I'm really excited to jump right on into the meat. Before I do that, though, I want to take a moment to get to know the panelists a bit better. So let's quickly just go around the virtual room here and get to know them. So if each of you don't mind just quickly sharing, like, what's one thing you could be found doing outside of work when you're not focusing on your product marketing function? Let's start with Charlene.
Sure. I mean, one thing is pretty limiting there. I guess I've been playing tennis, so there's that, but I also do like to spend a lot of time, as you know, many of the panelists here in the Bay Area, there's a lot of places to explore with friends and family. So Napa and hiking and, you know, a lot of great places.
Awesome. How about you, Sarah?
I think similar to Charlene, like we spend so much of our time in front of screens, like laptops and phones. Like when it's the weekend, I just want to get out. And living in the Bay Area, we're fortunate. There's like just amazing nature and hikes. So whether it's that or just being outdoors somewhere, like that's just generative for me. So I try to do that as much as I can.
Great. John?
I'm kind of afraid of nature, so I like more screens. I'm kind of a film nerd, so recently worked through a lot of Almodovar's films. I'm trying to get into Werner Herzog, so if anyone's got any secrets to Gira Wrath of God, let me know.
Love it. I'm more in Charlene and Sarah's camp. Outside of work, I like to be outside. I'm fortunate I live up here in Marin, the birthplace of mountain biking, and I typically spend a lot of time mountain biking. So that's what I try to do to get away from the screens. But let's jump into like one of the first questions. It was the highest voted question, and there was a lot of themes through the other questions that were submitted. Let me make sure I get to is like there are many kinds of market research, right? So like let's talk about some specifics. What types of market research are the most important for product marketing? We can have a laundry list. So I want to start with a panelist to share 1 to 3, like really honing in like what are the most important kinds of market research that product marketing needs to focus on? And we'll do a reverse order. Let's start with you, John.
I think, you know, I always think of research and insights as a continuum. So on the most structured and, you know, as a former, you know, kind of Forrester person, the most structured, like people that are much smarter than me at things like statistics. It's been a long time since I knew what any of that stuff meant. The people that are doing like conjoint analysis for pricing, it's a big part, even if my team is contributing to that, but, you know, not necessarily owning. We have actual like skilled data and researcher folks. That continuum, that side, if it's well paneled and the data is well handled, super important. And that's something we do, you know, currently at Unity and other places I've been, that type of very structured, you know, conjoint analysis around things like pricing or feature configuration, things that are really important in terms of putting forth the offer. I think on the other end, from a market research standpoint, I think that the sort of insights you can pick up on, you know, for example, I do a lot of, my career has mostly been around marketing technical stuff to technical people, a lot of developer tools. So I learn a ton on Discord, on Reddit deep dives from an insight and sentiment standpoint that I think can complement. It becomes a little bit more subjective, but I think, you know, like anything else, you start to do pattern recognition over time. And so to have that balance of like, hey, we've done a really controlled, structured, highly analytical and statistically correct type of study, those can be fantastic and get a lot of mileage out of. But I think always having a pulse on like, what are people talking about, particularly in those types of channels that are away from vendor controlled voices? I don't ever speak up and like, oh, I run product marketing at Unity. Like I just lurk on those things all day. I think those things are super important.
I love the way you're getting to that. You know, I most recently ran product marketing at a company called Pendo, and really balancing that quantitative insights along with the qualitative insights are really important. You don't want to over-index on one versus the other. So like focusing on both is great. How about you, Sarah? Like what are the kinds of market research you think a product marketer should focus on?
Yeah, the way I like to think about it at the end of the day, if you're to boil it down to like the core thing we do, it's really about understanding the people that you're trying to market to, right? And so underneath that, you can talk about quant and qual and the forms and the channels you use, but the types of research that really gets you to understand these users, and that can come in a few different forms that we prioritize, right? One is just running surveys for primary research and really depending on what you're trying to do, but understanding their needs, their challenges, how they think. Supplementing that with interviews. We do a lot of expert insight sort of interviews through a few companies that offer that to really just talk to people and understand what they're facing and what problems we can help solve for them. So I think if there is one thing product marketing needs to prioritize, it's the research that really gets you those insights, because that's going to serve a lot of purposes. The second piece of that, because that's your users or your customers, and then the other side of it is understanding your competitors. So I consider competitive to also be market research. It's insights in general, right? And so that's the other side that I think PMMs should prioritize. It's understanding who else is serving that need so that you can really figure out how to differentiate and position yourself. And then to your point, I think it's important to do a mix of quant and qual within those.
Love it. Can you share like just one example? I love the way you mentioned like running surveys and expert interviews. What's an example of an initiative where you wanted to run surveys or do these expert interviews for?
We do these often. Right now, we are working on really refining our use cases at Quickbase. And so because our product, not to go into too much detail, but it's very much a horizontal platform. It can do a lot of things for different people. So in order to refine like the top ones, we really have to understand what are the biggest problems customers have that we can solve for, where there's the biggest opportunity. So we're running different surveys in the market for our ICP to kind of do a market research survey. We're supplementing that with a user survey in our product through Pendo and through our email. And then we have a couple of companies we work with, consulting firms, where you can give them sort of your ICP and they can give you prospects that fit that role. And you can do like 30 to 60-minute interviews with them. So we're doing all of those things to really help refine our use cases. That's one example of that.
Love it. Charlene, how about yourself? What type of market research is most important for product marketing?
Yeah, right. And to me, I interpreted this as more the framing overall, because there's so many different types of research that you can do. There's a lot of different tactics. I have, an entire slew of things that we look at. But at the end of the day, I think the core of product marketing is really understanding, can I speak to the buyer, to the competitors, and the market? So that to me is the big framing of, what does the buyer look like? Am I educated on what they're looking for, what their journey looks like? In terms of competitors, what else is out there? And this could also include substitutes. So not just direct competitors, but other companies are sort of in your tangential space and doing something that's similar to what you're doing, where somebody who's looking at you as a buyer might be interested in another solution that might not be an exact tech solution, but is comparable. And then finally, the overall market. Do I know what else is happening in the overall trends, what's impacting the overall kind of industry and the other kind of players within that space? Within those buckets, there's quantitative, there's qualitative analysis that you can do, and there's a whole bunch of different research tactics. But I think at the end of the day, what you want to ask is, can I have an informed perspective that I can go to sales, I can go to product, I can go to other operational teams and make sure that we are giving them the information that they need to inform a really well thought out and successful go-to-market strategy.
Love it. I love the grouping of those three high-level buckets, and there's both quant and qual under each. And I think that the group nailed a lot of the key things I would have shared myself. And I love that kind of John led with, like, one of my must-haves for market research that sometimes people overlook is pricing and packaging. Sometimes that's something that I find frequently people lead with emotion. And he talked about his max diff, the classic Van Westendorp, that simple forced question. You need to get research. And what I try to find is you could do research within your own customer base, but also your potential customers, people who aren't your customers yet, who meet your ideal customer profile. That's one area that over my career, I've sometimes had to have the discussions like, hey, we need to do research here to make an effective decision. Like, this is one that I'll dig my heels in on. Let's go to the second question, which is kind of related, but it's a very different level of altitude. A lot of people wanted to know, like, what are your go-to tools or resources when conducting market research? So, no, it's very broad. And as Charlene just mentioned, there's all sorts of research. So if anyone could just mention like a tool or two that they really think is really helpful for them in their career. Let's start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit biased in some of the tools. I used to work at SurveyMonkey, and so I run product marketing there. So that is definitely one of my go-to tools for just general surveys, but also they have a panel that I love using and tapping into. Similar to that is Winter. I've used that for message testing. And then I was talking a little bit about expert panels and interviews. I've used a few different firms, so kind of I consider them a tool, but it's like Bridger or GLG. And then I'd say Pendo is definitely one where I point to for customer research, or Dovetail user testing. And then for competitive, we use Clue.
Okay, great. How about you, Charlene?
I have a long-winded answer, so let me try to keep this short.
No, let's go for it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different categories of tools. I think so 8 different categories I think about are industry-specific publications, which are more specific to your industry. And in our case, we're in real estate, so there's a lot of, Housing Wire, and some of these are very specific to us. There's research platforms out there. So there's things like AlphaSense, CB Insights, Crunchbase, LexisNexis, et cetera. Those are tools that give you kind of a broad lay of the land of different types of companies that are either your potential customers or your competitors. That gives you some information that you can use to get some high level insights. From there, there's also news aggregators. So I think about things like Meltwater or Google Alerts, where you can kind of set an alert and make sure that you're keeping track of what's happening in the overall news and anything that's coming out in social media. There's analysts and influencers with that's more general. So you have Gartner, Forrester, IDC, or within kind of software buying, there's G2, Software Advice, et cetera. For competitor research, there's things like Clue, Compite, Cran, et cetera. Those are really good for kind of aggregating some of the competitor insights you've had from across the company and other sources. Expert networks, which is like GLG, Tegus, et cetera. And then within your own sales process and customers, you can kind of collect information and data from that. So looking at things like Gong, looking at Clue, Closed, there's a bunch of surveys you can run within your own customer base and product analytics as well. And then finally, you have general consultants. So I think Buyer Persona Institute is one I've heard on the understanding your ICP a little bit better, but there's a lot of others kind of in that space.
Love it. Sean, how about yourself?
Well, Charlene and Sarah didn't leave a whole lot, but they were great answers, covered a lot. I will say the one thing that has always been, to me, like the super hidden nugget that I found, particularly on the enterprise side, this may not be as relevant for consumer. Actually, it's not relevant for consumer, but on the enterprise software, RFPs are magic. If RFPs weren't free and flowing into the organization, I would pay for them. And not only does it give a sense of, because I think it's a really good check too, so that you're not like within your own biodome of thinking in terms of like, however you describe your platform or your offering, how your customers ask about stuff is actually a cheat code for messaging. But it also lays out the competitive work. And from your Forrester thing, like everyone plays the games with, the Gartners and the Forresters and IDCs. And when 451 was a thing where you adjust the Magic Quadrant or whatever it is to sort of help define your feature set. And so that influences what customers ask for. So especially if you're at a place where we're all in a time where marketing budgets are a little crunchier than they were before. RFPs are free. They're sitting around. Buddy up with your sales team. Get your RFPs. I have them all sitting in a folder. And to me, that's just eating your vegetables. Read those RFPs.
Love that. I want to build on something that you mentioned. Sometimes internally, when we say market research, people assume it has to be at massive scale, right? The point of the RFP, just hearing the words that your customers in the market are saying, and to build off something Charlene said, like, I'm mildly addicted to Gong when I'm at a company, or it could be Clary, whatever tool it is, like listening to the sales calls, listening to the words that your customers and your potential customers are actually saying. You don't need to have a formal market research study to get that really valuable market insights, and just making sure you make the time to do that is really valuable. Since we are product marketers, there was a fair number of questions about value props. Right? Like, what are some channels or steps for testing value props and key messaging, as part of research? And anyone want to start for this one?
I I can start. I like to use a variety of channels. I think every channel will give you a little bit of different perspective. So the easiest one is to just run A/B tests, whether it's on your website or any sort of like ad campaigns that you're running, just tweak and test it. It's like just the quickest way to test any key messaging. I've also done message testing surveys. I think those can be really, really valuable, especially if you're shifting your messaging in a really big way. You can test out elevator pitches and things like that, and supplementing that with interviews that I talked about, like just having like somebody react to it and call out like, oh, those words feel very buzzwordy, or this doesn't really apply to me. We also leverage our CAB a lot, our customer advisory board as well. I think that can be such a great resource that a lot of people don't think about. And we run the CAB on my team, so we have access to it in a way that really is helpful. So we'll leverage that a lot and supplement that with like one thing that I have found is your sales team. To Joan's point, you should, sort of sit with them and become best friends with them in whatever way, shape, and form. And I've in the past done like a pilot group of salespeople and just given them like a new deck, something that they can go out and test with real customers in real conversations and see how that sort of helps and resonates. And then analysts, like we'll often do, like, I think a lot of people don't think about the fact that analysts have this ability to kind of read briefing documents and give you feedback on things like messaging. So I think doing a combination of all of those things can be really helpful on giving you feedback.
All right. Anything else to add from Charlene or John?
Yeah, I think Sarah gave a really good answer there. One thing I'll just kind of add on top of that is there's a difference between passive and active testing. So to me, passive is the message is out there, you're kind of observing it in the wild and see if it's actually resonating or not, and then looking at metrics to see if that's actually moving deals forward. And then active is when you're actually putting message in front of somebody and say, hey, I am explicitly testing this message. I want you to give me feedback on this. So for me, a lot of the passive forms are actually really important as well. So that's looking at when you put your message out there, selectively looking at like gong calls, for instance, and seeing, is the sales rep using this correctly? Is the prospect or customer reacting in the way that you would expect? And seeing if that's something that you need to adjust. Another thing I think is really important there is looking at, so I'm a big fan of sales enablement platforms and content management tools like Seismic, HighSpot. There's a couple of others, Showpad, and a couple of others out there. But looking at when you put messaging out there, is it being used in the sales cycle? How's it engaging? How are prospects engaging with it? Has that driven any actual pipeline? And just kind of observing it along the way. You can also do this in product. There's a lot of product analytics tools that allow you to kind of get that information, or on the website. And then on the other hand, the active testing, I think, is something that we all kind of are it's near and dear to all of our hearts, but, putting it in front of prospects, in front of customers, using things like Winter to see if the message that you create is actually resonating. So I think having both passive and active ways of testing messaging is equally important.
All right.
And
John?
one thing I'd add to sort of what Sarah was saying earlier about analysts, again, apologies, this is more for the enterprise folks, but I think that often it's a natural inclination, but to look at those relationships, and Jason, you'd probably appreciate it from your old roles, like a little transactional. The vendors show up to try to get you to do their thing. And we forget that analysts, folks like Jason, are practitioners. They know stuff, and they also talk to the other vendors. So I'm going to use like the Gartner terminology of like, don't turn everything into a briefing, do inquiries. And I always think of inquiries of like, I'm gonna listen for 2/3 to 3/4 of that call. I'm going to put out, whatever the category or the area or the potential value prop, create space for the analyst to fill in the gaps with their knowledge, their observations, and invariably that's going to give you insights into what they're hearing from their clients, but also what they're hearing from other vendors. So I think people forget that, and they always think of like your job is to sort of influence the analyst to push things one way or the other, but also, it's a two-way relationship. And especially if you're doing things like category creation, which may take a long time. I've been in situations where, that magic quadrant that you want to place well in isn't going to show up for 2 or 3 years. So it's a very, very slow twitch muscle. Doing a lot of that early on will not only build the relationships needed, but also help that kind of fine tune the signal to noise. So it's a nuance. And I think it's like people are moving fast and you're thinking of it transactionally, but like set up those meetings and just listen. because it's a really good conduit for especially on the enterprise side. You know, what are the IT buyers are thinking? What kind of lines of business leaders are thinking?
Yeah, and actually just kind of building off that as well. I think the one thing with testing messaging is that the way you do it is equally as important as how is the channel that you're using, because I think a lot of times it's almost too easy to want your message to work. And so there's a little bit of bias coming into some of those. If you're just putting something in front of a prospect and a customer and you're listening, a lot of times there's a little bit of bias of like, oh, we created this, I hope it works. And so there's something you have to do to really take a step back and say, okay, well, what does success look like? What are some of the signals that this is actually resonating or not? And really being open to listening. So I think like John's point around when you go into to an analyst and you're on some kind of inquiry or briefing, especially like having a perspective of this person might know something and the way that they're communicating something is actually really important. And what they're saying is equally as important as what I am saying. So I think that's a good framing.
Yeah, I love that. You know, it's we have this balance of quant and qual. I spent some time running product marketing at a company called Optimizely a few years back, an A/B testing company. And in this day and age, there's such a drive towards performance and be able to measure this. But to build off something that Sarah mentioned, like cabs are tremendously valuable. These are thought leaders in the industry. And going even one step beyond the cab, it's like other people in the industry who might not be a customer yet, they might not be on your cab, but have a point. Like, I think that part of our jobs, the way we can differentiate ourselves as product marketers are being in market, whether that's going to industry conferences, whether that's going with our sales team to meet with customers and talking to those potential customers, talking with people who aren't quite customers yet. I've gathered really interesting insight regarding value props, like when I go to a trade show with my sales team and I'm working the booth and I'm going around, or just from being in the industry, knowing people saying, hey, I know you're not a customer right now, going to Charlene's active, can I test some value props with you? Like, you know this subject better than anyone I know. And just like having that qualitative, that one-off, not scalable conversation, sometimes you can yield some of the best insights. I want to transition to one of the questions that seem to come up multiple ways, is like, how do you divide and conquer or really collaborate on market research between your product management colleagues, or if you have a competitive intel team or any other stakeholders who might also be doing market research? Anyone have any thoughts on how to collaborate with other folks within your own business who are also trying to do market research?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a risk, and I've seen it unfortunately a lot of times in my career, a bunch of different places where, you know, everyone kind of is off trying to do the right thing, but there's a lot of stepping on toes and overlap. You know, I'm sure we've all walked into places and you realize, oh, well, here's the customer segmentation that the product team has, and here's the customer segmentation that the sales team has, and here's the product segmentation that the marketing team has, and it's just bad news for everybody. And I think that ends up like creating, you have to be careful that product or that this type of market research doesn't become its own closed loop. And so yeah, I would say the human element of coordination and alignment is super important. So that there isn't just a sort of perpetual motion machine of someone like, well, I'm in a researcher role, so I'm going to be doing a bunch of research. And that's tough. I mean, that's just classic, you know, company alignment work. But yeah, I think it's the roles and responsibility. What's the aligned goal? I would say the inclination, I would over time, over the time of my career, people probably waste a lot more research than they use. And it's tough because it's expensive. It eats up a lot of time. It can be a big blow to morale internally. And I'm sure we've all gone, you know, started a new job or moved over to a new role, and you find on some share somebody just like a ghost ship of a persona research thing, and you know, it's like an old west town. So just got to be really careful about that. I would say in terms of like hard lines of like, well, this is what product does and this is what marketing does. I think I've found more success on a per initiative basis, and making sure people are bought in, because what you don't want is a bunch of competing initiatives. So again, you end up with here are the 6 different persona structures that a company has, at which point then you basically have nothing.
Yeah, to add to, I 100% agree. I think every time I've heard any question come up about working well with product or sales, or how do you collaborate on any topic, even like outside of market research. It does come down to just building that right relationship between the leadership and making sure that you're setting clear expectations of the teams on the roles and responsibilities. And it can come down to racing models where I like that idea of like having it be specific to specific initiatives, right? Because that can be more helpful. But then also, I think tied to that, being very focused in your efforts, like whether you do it quarterly, annually, or like, you know, however you plan. If there are big things happening, like you're about to launch a certain product or capability, aligning all of your efforts to that so that everyone's kind of looking at different lenses for the same thing versus running in different directions. I think that can also sort of foster this collaborative effort where everyone's sort of contributing and working together and not just doing 20,000 different things. So I think those two things are really important at a high level for pretty much any initiative across teams that have to do, you know, work on or look at different sides of the coin.
Yeah, the way I see it is competitor research, or really any research, market research, it's a team sport that needs to be quarterbacked by somebody. So there's a lot of times when you get this sort of like messy chaos, conflict, whatever it is, it's, you know, everyone's kind of trying to find their own information because they need it for a specific purpose. And then it's not very clear who's doing what. And I think there's a couple of distinct roles that need to happen for effective market research of any type. So the first is proactively seeking out the right information, or kind of gathering the right information in some way. The second is centralization of the information so that it can be easily digested. And then the third is the analysis and sharing out of that information to all the right parties so that they can actually take action on it. So what I oftentimes see is like, well, sales is doing their own thing, product has their own research, they need to understand, you know, how some buyer is going to interact with this widget within the product. And then product marketing is kind of like, wait a minute, everyone, what's going on? So I think if you can break down those specific tasks of what is it that we across different teams need to know? Who is most suited to being able to gather that information? Or does it already exist as tribal knowledge somewhere? And can we just take that and centralize that? And then you talk about like, well, what is the mechanism by which we're collecting all this information so that not just product is getting that information, but, you know, so is marketing, so sales, so is operations, whoever else needs to interact with that information, and then align on here's what we're going to do to get that alignment across the board and make sure that we're getting that information in a usable, digestible format. And then if you can take that and then somebody has to do the work of actually making that information digestible and then sharing it back out to all the different parties, I think that really helps. That framing helps to kind of clear up a little bit the chaos, and it makes it a little bit clearer to everyone, like, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and then here's the value add that we're going to bring to the table, not just, you know, take away from your, you know, competitor research initiative.
So Charlene, you hit on like the next question I was going to ask. So I want to start with you is like, so now you've decided who's going to do the research, and product marketing is doing some specific research efforts. How do you recommend surfacing that information to the right leadership, executive stakeholders so that information can actually be actionable? So I was getting through some of the questions that tone that sometimes people do research, but then they don't know what to do with it. So how do you surface those insights to the right stakeholders and then take action on that?
Yes, I think it's really important to start first and foremost with what are we as an organization trying to achieve? So that comes out of an understanding the overall priorities of the company. What are some of the growth initiatives that we are working on as a company? In our case, like, we're trying to grow in the SMB while going up market, while also kind of monetize and expand our platform. So those are kind of the three big buckets. And then within those, there are specific challenges that kind of come up that across different teams, you really need to be able to address in order to be effective. And then from there, you can kind of identify where are some of the knowledge gaps. And then I like to go from there and say, okay, well, here are some of the initiatives that we're working on in terms of really understanding the market. Here's what we need to know. Does sales already know this? Okay, great. Then let's take that information. Let's just kind of structure and process it so that everyone else can know that. And then let's agree what's the timeline that we're going to get that back to everyone else. Or is that something that we need to stand up? Or is that something we need to work with product on? So I think first and foremost, start with what the organization is trying to achieve, build a program based on that, where you have clear timelines, clear outcomes, clear deliverables and owners. And then that helps to kind of inform what kind of cadence and what kind of information needs to be shared back out.
But any other observations about how to share insights across the organization?
I feel like part of it is sometimes in organizations, you have to almost kind of create a cultural shift of how people consume insights. If you're in an organization where that hasn't been the case, or it's kind of disjointed or not programmatic. And so I've found value in creating these programs over time that sort of build this culture of just consuming data, research, information, and then figuring out how to consume that in the work that they're doing. So for instance, at my current company, we've created this program around go-to-market insights. So it's not just this like insights on a specific thing, it's a broader program. And we'll partner with different teams every quarter focused on what Charlene was saying. What is the big sort of strategic initiative or goal for the company? And then think of all the insights that would help different teams for that. So let's say, for instance, we would partner with product and do a readout of insights where we've done some market research, some product research, and present a holistic sort of point of view on a certain topic that relates to what we're working on. And we'll do that on an ongoing basis. The second piece to that, I think, which is important, is I found this very interesting, that people consume information in different ways. Like you can do readouts and people listen or glaze over and it's like they didn't get anything. Some people like to just take their time and read documents and go deep, right? Some just want bite-sized information. So also thinking about how you actually share this data and information in multiple ways. And some organizations have certain cultures of sharing that. So like it varies. Like in my company right now, everyone loves PowerPoint decks, and other companies, it's all Word docs, right? Like it shifts. And so really thinking about what that is and how you share it over time consistently and get people used to learning and understanding and applying these insights in some way. I think big picture, that's really important.
Yeah, I think I would just add, that again, you have to be really careful about research for research's sake. And I've seen all sorts of studies like, that's interesting, I don't know what to do with this. So make sure that whatever research is tied to a specific deliverable that people understand and has weight within the organization. So this is either going to drive website copy, or this is going to drive pricing of a new product or package, or what is the feature set in, whatever SKUification is going to happen, or, something of like, we're doing this research in order to better inform this thing that we could stand up. And whether you're an e-staff or at any level of the organization, like, oh, this is a sales deck, right? So this is our first call deck, and this first call deck is going to be informed by this research, and we're going to have a better and a different version of the first call deck because of this research. I think in my experience, I think people are most dialed in to research if it does result in like, what is the change state? And if without a change state, that's where it becomes a little abstract, and I think it can just sort of drift around an org for a while without really doing much.
Yeah, just to like tying the research either to an outcome or a specific initiative, building a little off of something that Sarah said that really resonated with me, is like, it's not uncommon if you're doing like a major product launch potentially to a new audience, like that product launch, that product that bringing to market motion will have some natural visibility with the executive stakeholders. Research plays a natural place in that overall initiative. It's not research for research's sake. It's research as part of this new initiative for a new target audience where you had to do research. So it's very natural. There are other things such as competitive intelligence, and I'm going to just mention that because it came up quite frequently in the questions, where it might make sense just to have a normal cadence, right? I worked at companies in the past where there will be a very detailed quarterly competitive win-loss analysis. As part of that analysis that goes to the executive team that might inform part of the board deck, there are clear action items. The action items might be, hey, we need to enable against competitor X because they are gaining traction on us, or we might need to do more research on this capability because a couple of our competitors seem to be there. So it's just part of the motion having next steps, but like having that cadence. And then to build on another theme that came through is like, people are consuming information differently. So there might be regular monthly newsletters on a specific topic. There might be short video forms. There might be, you have to experiment because people are learning differently, especially as we have distributed teams. You just need to share that information in a variety of ways. I'm going to take one last question here, and then I'm going to jump into the panel because we had so many questions in advance. It's like, how do you approach research when your product marketing team is understaffed? Right? You just don't have enough, you don't have time, you feel like you barely have enough to keep up with your day job. Then how do you think about and approach market research?
I mean, I think it kind of came up in a few different ways. Prioritization is key, and tying it to a big outcome that the company cares about. Like, you just have to, like, I know as PMs, we probably want to research everything and understand everything, but you just have to prioritize. And another way of doing that in a more structured way could be, like, I've often done this on previous teams where I'd be like, okay, Fridays, set aside an hour, I'll block it for the entire team, and you're just going to listen to gong calls. And then next team meeting, we're just going to share what we learned, right? Like, and just like structurally just setting aside a little bit of time every, like, so often, so that we're just doing it over a course of time rather than making it a big thing and it making it feel like, oh God, like I have to spend hours on do something and I already have a list of things to do that I don't have enough time for, right? Like, just making it as part of your day-to-day process makes it feel a little bit more achievable. So I think those are two very simple ways of just doing that.
Yeah, and I would just say again, like there's always going to be more requests for research or ideas for research than are actually anchored to something that's real. So again, it kind of comes back to prioritization. I think it's the flip side of the earlier question around not stepping on the toes of, well, what if there's a central market research team, and what if there's a people in product or the UX teams? There was a period of time when UX was sort of dabbling in sort of all areas of a lot of this work. So you definitely don't, you want to make sure that if the UX team has already gone off and done a customer segmentation that does 75% of your research and gets you close enough, and you're in a capacity crunch, just take it and go. Reutilize as much as possible, or what's the lightest amount of refresh. But I would say, the inclination is there will always be a superset of ideas that come in around research, and just be careful, because to do research, particularly do research well, as we all know, like it's you can't wing it. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. And so I think it's much better to do fewer of those things that you can leverage across a bunch of initiatives than to spin up discrete studies for all these things that, again, may not materialize into much of an impact.
Yeah, I think Sarah and John covered a lot about prioritization, and prioritization is key. That's the most important thing in terms of pretty much anything, but especially with research, because you can go down a rabbit hole infinitely, and there's always more that you can research. So it's really kind of going back to like, well, what do I need this information for? How do I plan to use it? The other 2 points I'll just note in addition to that is, the first and foremost is a lot of times we do the research, but we don't think about how to make that research go further. So there are actually things that you can do to make sure that you're not just doing research, but it's actually kind of sitting in, for instance, centralization tools. Are you putting it into some place where other people can access it afterwards? Is it structured in such a way that people can actually kind of pull the insights that they need out of that research afterwards? So that's one thing, which is like, I always think about like, how can I take this thing that we are already doing and get more leverage out of it for my organization, for the rest of the organization? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that research is like, even if you don't have much time for it, on occasion, I would always try to here and there do a sanity check, and try to even like set aside some time to say, like, I'm going to just do open-ended sanity check on whether my messaging is working, whether the market is responding the way I would like it to, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, like, I always try to squeeze some time, no matter what, to speak to a customer here and there. And I think it's a good habit to get into for the rest of the team as well, which is like always not necessarily going in to say, hey, I need to know this, but being like, it's a good thing to make sure that you're continuing to do is just stay in touch with the market, with your customers.
I love that. And the way I would answer this question is that in most cases, I actually don't think of research as something else. I think it's a core responsibility of our job, and it's tied to some other initiative that you already have, right? So I would just have a mind shift that's like, it's not like, how do I make time for research? It's like, what company initiatives would perform better if I did research? What company initiatives, efforts such as pricing and packaging absolutely require research to accomplish this goal, right? So think of it that way, and just making the time. Building off of something that Charlene mentioned, I always ask my teams to prioritize listening to customers as part of their job. And I defer to them how they're going to do that, whether that's going to trade shows, whether that's sitting in on sales calls, whether that's listening to gong calls. People have different preferences, different life situations, but like making sure they prioritize getting insight somehow should just be part of the motion. I'm going to transition to the Q&A. So if anyone who's still listening wants to submit some questions, please do. I'll go through as many of them as we can. But I'll start with, here's one question. How do you frame interview questions that get a customer to truly share their problems with you? Sometimes their problems feel deeper than what they actually share. Anyone want to start with that?
You know, going back to the first question, I think I've been lucky enough to work with some vendors who have done really good formal studies with panels, and I think that there are, in the continuum of like market research should be everyone's job. There are also people that are like skilled, trained market researchers, and people who, you set aside that budget and they get the right panels. And I've had a lot of, I've been in places where we've had a lot of success doing both blind and semi-blind type of studies, because I think the hard part is the inclination, and like the just grab it off the shelf. If we have a beta project and you work with a PM and then there's like a customer they're working with, and it's just sort of validation of biases and like, yeah, they're basically your buddy or they're someone you're working with, versus people being paneled. They don't know it's you. They're talking to somebody in a very structured way, in an open-ended way. And I think that was interesting. The first time I worked in a study like that, on the input side from us, we over-designed it. We said too much. We filled in too many gaps. And them, as being market research experts, came back and said, no, you're leading the witness. Like you're going to get, it's garbage in and garbage out. And it was interesting how much restraint had been put in there. And then I also felt that there was a lot of value in terms of how would you, talking about people's problems and allowing the customers to fill that space. And then how would you feel about a solution that did X, Y, and Z? Well, before, how do you feel about that solution now when it comes from vendor A or B? And I think that sort of semi-blind notion of a study, I've gotten much higher fidelity stuff from that versus, it's the whole thing of like, every PM thinks, well, I talk to customers all the time. You talk to the same 2 customers that you have white glove meetings with every week. Like they're basically your cousins. Like, no offense, I'm kind of, the validity of that data isn't very great. So I think, again, it's those things, those types of very formal structures are expensive. They take a lot of time, but if you do it right, it can make up for 10, sort of mediocre or below type of inquiries. So that's my experience.
Yeah, and I like on the one end, you have the very objective kind of, professionally done interview surveys where you're kind of trying to understand how customers are responding or what they're looking for. On the other side, there's actually, I think, very relationship-based conversation. You have to be very careful about how to do that because, to John's point, you can introduce a lot of bias, but I do think it's actually also important in some cases to really dive in with specific customers and get a very deep empathy for how they go about their day-to-day lives. So this sometimes will involve going on site and kind of sitting down with them and not asking. And the big thing I think about there is not focusing so much on your product and what you are trying to sell, but really on the customer. So what does your day-to-day look like? What are your priorities as a customer? What are some of the things that really annoy you? What are the things that you're so excited about, both at a company level and at an individual level? And a lot of times when you get those responses, you're able to kind of take that back, think about it and say, okay, well, how does our product actually fit into that overall context? And then you're able to come to creative solutions around, the way that you need to message something or any feedback that needs to go back to the product team. So I think the big thing there is having a really deep empathy that comes from a place of understanding the customer and not so much like my perspective of what I want the customer to do.
Is there anything else to add?
I think both John and Charlene covered a lot of it. I think I like that idea of using your relationships to dig deeper. I think at the end of the day, in an interview where you're talking to somebody, if you just kind of have a conversation rather than make it feel like an interview and you're just kind of digging into how they feel about certain things and what problems they're having, that will give you so much more. And that also goes beyond the words that they're saying, like their body language and sort of like the other cues that they give you can be really, really helpful as well in how they react to certain things. So I think it's just like really like having more of a conversation than asking questions. On the other end, when you build surveys, like that has to be it's an art. Building surveys is an art, and asking the right questions is also an art. And there's a ton out there of how to do that well.
Yeah, one of the things I would just kind of summarize the theme is like, try not to ask leading questions. Try to keep them a little more open so they feel free. And one of the things I always prepare is, what's the follow-up question I want to ask? There's kind of a decision tree. They're going to answer one way or the other. And if they answer a certain way, what's that follow-on question? Because I usually find a lot when you're doing like live questions, not surveys, you can get a lot of really, really valuable insights with just the follow-on questions. All right. Here's another question. It's that, what do you do if you're working in a very traditional industry that doesn't have that much info out there about your customers' competitors? So there's not a lot of information out there. I'm a little, I want to respect the question as it's written, but so saying a traditional industry that doesn't have a lot of information. So I'm just going to take the latter part. What about what you're in an industry where there's not a lot of public information about competitors or not? Like, how would you approach that situation?
I immediately think of government, because that's a good example of an industry where it's really hard, because one of our industries that we focus on is public sector. And especially if you're selling to IT, like there's all kinds of security and things that you have to kind of go through to even understand that world. And so you have to leverage the relationships you have, and customers are key to that. And, you know, just understanding their world, and like you will start to see patterns through that. There are, again, Bridger, GLG, all of these sort of companies, or like your company, your internal expertise might also have people out there that are kind of your prospects, leveraging those relationships as well, that are going to go a long way. But you know, in those industries, if there isn't a lot of knowledge out there, you just have to lean in on people that actually are coming from that industry. So ex-workers of that industry that have been in roles that you care about, right? Like just getting a little bit more creative there. That's where I've found success.
I can take that one because our industry is real estate. So depending on how you view it, it may or may not be traditional. So, and then in particular, we're on the closing side of the house. So when you actually buy a house, all the things that happen afterwards to get the documentation, everything all set. That is a very, it's not that it's definitely, it's vertical SaaS, right? So we're going after a specific vertical. It's not something where you have this like, you know, big association around the world that does, you know, that specific thing. It's a little bit more niche. So I think with industries like that, you just adapt your tactics a little bit more based on kind of what works in that industry. So for us, right, for instance, and this is actually true for a lot of these more niche industries, events actually work very well. People like going to events. They kind of like it's almost like an emotional support group for people who are doing this, because it is so highly specialized and it's such a highly regulated space, and there's so much nuance, and there's so many specific things that they're dealing with you know, upswings and downswings in the market. And so they tend to gravitate towards specific venues and specific kind of analysts. So we really try to meet the customer where they're at, and that's a good place to kind of get in research and intelligence. I think the biggest thing here is, if you have an industry where there's not much open information out there, you have to create your own channels to get information. So you're not maybe relying on things that work for horizontal players as much, but you're kind of thinking like, what is the specific industry associations that really know this sector very well? Where can I go meet these customers? So there's an added layer of complexity of trying to figure out those channels.
And I think one other thing is, there may not be the traditional types of information or data that's been available, but I think, you know, particularly now, and it obviously depends on the industry, you know, public sector is a very sort of, especially in the US, a very unique thing. But you know, I've found competing vendor user groups, or if it's an open source project, there's a tremendous amount of sort of self-reported information you can find all over the place. Tons of companies, you know, last several companies I've been to, we've invested very heavily in sort of a community function where there is a user forums and discussion forums that are deep and rich. And if you really want to find out what the life is like of those customers, what problems they're trying to solve, and what problems they're not interested, I think it's a real good sanity check to be like, well, here's what we think is important. Well, what are people actually talking about in the discussion forums? Again, in certain niche forums like Discord. I just think there's, again, tons of stuff now that vendors and customers freely give away that a generation or so would have been very, very expensive market research.
Got it. We have time for one last question, and then I'll hand it off to Alex to wrap up. This is a question. Oh, the thing just moved a little bit. Sorry. So like, I think it's in terms of team and responsibilities. Like, at what point in time should you have a product marketer dedicated to this, or are there other responsibilities this role should have as well?
I think it depends on the size of your organization and the sort of like the amount, like the maturity of your go-to-market, right? So I think that those two factors play a role. So currently on my team, I do have a pillar of my team just focused on insights, but that's very broad. Like they cover not just one type of research. So within that pillar, they cover AR, they cover CAB, competitive, win-loss, market research, sort of all of that. And there's two people that are dedicated to that, but they don't work in isolation. They work across all of the other teams to supplement. So they'll work with the UX team, they'll work with sales and all of the other teams in marketing that are sort of looking at this in different angles. So I think that answer varies depending on a few different factors, but the maturity of your go-to-market is one important factor. Like if you're in early stages, sometimes I can say you can actually make a case for research is way more important, but do you have the headcount and the budget to do it? Or is that a secondary part of your team? So it depends how big your team is as well, right? So either you create a hybrid role if you don't have the budget or the resources for headcounts, but if you have that, and if your model is mature enough, you need an ongoing sort of research support, then I say dedicate a resource to it.
Anything else to add?
I would just reiterate that it's everyone's job.
Yeah.
That, and certainly all the PMMs in my team and other teams, like if you're creating a messaging brief, hope there's research behind it, right? Like you've talked to customers, you've done competitive research. So I think there's an element of it, particularly from a market insight standpoint, like that should just be built into the DNA of the job that everyone does. And then the flip side of it, if we're talking about really structured, statistically relevant stuff that has math that's beyond my capabilities, often, again, from the state of your go-to-market, like there's a formal market research folks with people who have titles with data in it and have that type of training. So I think that's the continuum. But I think like there's as a PMM, like that's an always on motion.
Have you, Charlene?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Sarah and John pretty much covered it, but I think at the end of the day, the size of the team overall, a lot of times determined by the overall size of the company, by priorities, by, different staffing models. But then within that team, how you divide up the different roles, how you kind of allocate that is, I think, very much determined by the priorities of the organization overall and what you're trying to achieve. So it could be that you have a person who's just going to do market research because they have a specialty in that, and you need that specialty, and you need somebody who's, has a very specialized skill set, or you just have enough capacity where that you can have that dedicated person or an entire team focused on that. But ultimately, it comes down to you have overall resourcing. Where is it best focused on? And if it makes sense to do something that's a little bit more dedicated, then it makes sense to do so.
The only thing I'll add is that I've been really focused on B2B enterprise software my entire career for more than 25 years. And I'd say in the product marketing function, it's rare to have a research generalist. Your company might have a research team, but I think it's pretty rare in B2B enterprise marketing to have that. You might have people who focus on competitive intelligence or analyst relations. And I've seen them be natural bedfellows in that, like you might have a market insights team that has both AR and competitive intelligence, like Sarah mentioned, but like having a fully dedicated market research, I don't think it's the standard motion. And with that, I want to wrap up and give it to Alex.
All right.